间谍必将遭到全面和彻底的试问。
主义的火炬照亮人类前行之路，不断崛起、不断扩大的国际影响力。
As the Aukus alliance backfired, Canberra warns Beijing of a red line after China signs a security pact with the Solomon Islands. Beijing says it has no plans to build a military base, but should Australia be worried? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Aukus alliance. When Australia, the UK, and the US came together to form the Aukus alliance in September, they never explicitly mentioned Beijing, though it was pretty clear a main objective of the pact was to counter Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. But 7 months later, there's huge concern after China and the Solomon Islands did this.
The Solomon Islands Foreign Minister, the Honourable Jeremiah Manele, has signed the Security Cooperation Framework with his People's Republic of China counterpart, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang He a few days ago.
The details of that framework haven't been made public, but the AUKUS nations are wary. They suspect the agreement could allow China to build a military base less than 2,000 kilometers from Australian shores. For Canberra, that's a red line. After the deal was signed, Australia's Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, said her government was deeply disappointed.
We understand, though, that this is a very serious decision that the Solomon Islands has made. We are, as we've said today, deeply disappointed that they have chosen to go down this path, but ultimately it is a sovereign decision for the Solomon Islands.
So how did we get to this point? Well, in 2019, the Solomon Islands established diplomatic ties with China after cutting ties with Taiwan. It was a divisive decision. Some within Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare's cabinet who didn't back the move were sacked. And last year, violent protests erupted, targeting Parliament and Chinese businesses. So what does this new security pact say about the extent of the relationship between Beijing and Honiara? Well, China says the deal has no military element whatsoever and urged all parties concerned not to jump to conclusions.
As two independent and sovereign countries, China and the Solomon Islands can carry out normal law enforcement and security cooperation on the basis of equal treatment and mutual benefit. This is in line with international law and practice, as well as conducive to maintaining social order in the Solomon Islands, promoting regional peace and stability, and enhancing the common interests of China and the Solomon Islands, as well as countries in the region. We hope that the parties concerned can look at it objectively and calmly and not over-interpret it.
Despite Australia's concern, the Solomon Islands is standing by the deal. Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare criticized Canberra for keeping his nation out of the loop when it formed the AUKUS alliance. He was dismayed to say he only learned about it through the media. But he also said his country's deal with China would not affect regional peace.
I ask all our neighbours, friends and partners to respect the sovereign interests of Solomon Islands on the assurance that the decision will not adversely impact or undermine the peace and harmony of our region. Let me assure the people of Solomon Islands that we entered into an arrangement with China with our eyes wide open, guided by our national interests. We have full understanding of the fragility of peace, and our duty as a state is to protect all people, their properties, and critical national infrastructures of the country.
So has the AUKUS alliance provoked a potentially greater security crisis in the Indo-Pacific? Joining me now to debate that from Brisbane is John Blaxland, a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Australian National University. From Beijing, Victor Gao, Suzhou University's chair professor. And from Washington, Patricia O'Brien, a historian and professor in the Asian Studies program at Georgetown University. Thanks all so much for being with us. AUKUS is, of course, the UK, the US, and Australia, but the Indo-Pacific is Australia's backyard. Chinese and Solomon Islands authorities are saying, don't exaggerate, don't jump to conclusions. Our security pact is just about us. But John Blaxland, would Australia be foolish not to worry?
Thanks, Andrea. Good to be with you. Yes, look, the problem is that China has clear interests in expanding its presence in the Pacific. There are compelling economic and strategic reasons to push back against Australia's close alignment with the United States. Australia has really surprised, I think, China at how strongly over the last few years it's pushed back. It pushed back on the 14 demands, the demands that Australia, including in domestic policy issues, comply with Chinese direction. We've seen here, this is, I think, a manifestation of Chinese attempts to influence Australia's neighbourhood in a way that is definitely about a bit of a quid pro quo for Australia being so closely aligned with the United States and so vocal in its criticism of China in the last couple of years.
Did Australia have to do what it did? Did it have to be that vocal? I mean, some would say provocative toward China?
So, there's, I think there's around the margins, there's some room for, manoeuvre about the rhetoric. Substantively, though, it's very hard for any Australian government to simply bow down and accept the kind of 14 points demands and the expectation that Australia should just follow China's lead, the lead of an authoritarian state that's basically been trying to ply Australia away from its alliance with the United States. And that's something that's got support from across both sides of the aisle in Parliament, in the Australian Parliament.
Okay, Victor Gao, I mean, should Beijing be believed when it says Australia shouldn't blow this out of proportion, that they have no intention of building a military base in the Solomon Islands, that this is just a basic security pact between two sovereign countries who have some common interests?
Indeed, I think Australia should acknowledge upfront that both China and the Solomon Islands are sovereign countries, and they have full discretion to decide what kind of agreement they want to sign between these two sovereign countries. And Australia should also acknowledge in the public that Solomon Islands does not have an overlord. If Australia believes Australia is the overlord of Solomon Islands, then come on, wake up. And further, Solomon Islands has a very large Chinese diaspora. And in the last round of domestic instability, for example, there was a lot of damage to the Chinese interests in Solomon Islands. And this is one driving reason why the Solomon Islands and China wanted to sign this security agreement between themselves to better protect the different communities in the Solomon Islands. And also, don't forget, Solomon Islands is not within Australia. It's about 2,000 kilometers away from Australia. And you mentioned about South Pacific. South Pacific is not the backyard of any country. South Pacific, together with the Pacific, is open to all international cooperation. China is a major force for international cooperation. Wake up if you do not realize that this is the mega trend of our time.
Okay. Let me get to Patricia then quickly. I mean, yeah, it's 2,000 kilometers away. It's nobody's backyard. Australia is in no position to see this as a threat anyway. And if the security pact, though, this is what I really have to ask, if it has no military element, as China says, what's it really for? And why have the details not been disclosed?
Well, I am not in a position to say why the details haven't been disclosed, but we do know from our Solomon Islands minister last week that the final signed document is close to the draft, and that does give China considerable opportunities to to get into the Solomon Islands in ways that people find concerning, particularly that Chinese military personnel will not be subject to Solomon Islands law and that they can be called in to for issues of civil unrest. And that's the kind of element that I find particularly disturbing and concerning, and what also concerns people in the Solomon Islands too, because of the unrest, that there's a lot of avenues and latitude that the agreement gives that really are not going to help civil order in the Solomon Islands, and actually it is a potential scenario where there's going to be some very serious issues for Solomon Islanders who disagree with the current Prime Minister. And that's what I find most concerning, is the erosion of democracy and the erosion of public safety that the agreement, we're talking about the security deal between China and the Solomon Islands, that's what I'm most concerned about.
Right. Okay, so John, I saw you chuckle at a lot of what Victor had to say, and then nod your head in agreement with Patricia there. We have to remember, though, at the same time, I mean, there are these pacts, Solomon China and Solomon Australia. They're meant to coexist, according to the authorities in the Solomon Islands. You've said before it's not popular, but is it possible for these agreements to coexist?
So, look, it may be possible to coexist, but one of them is completely opaque, and one of them is really not, we're not being straight with each other about this, what's going on here. Australia has been the principal beneficiary for the Solomon Islands in terms of aid and in terms of security guarantees. For 20 years, Australia has been sending troops, police and military, to assist the people of the Solomon Islands. And in November last year, when what Victor Gao talked about, Chinese interests being challenged inside Solomon Islands, who came to the rescue? Australia. We're the ones who provided the support. We are the ones who have, for more than 2 decades now, been actively and intimately involved in providing support to the people of Solomon Islands. What we're seeing here is effectively the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, having been effectively, it would appear, being bought off by China, because there's no other plausible explanation for the Solomon Islands, who has been the greatest beneficiary of Australian generosity, to refuse our advice, to refuse our counsel, and to turn to China, a country whose language they don't speak. Let's not forget, the Solomon Islands is a country, former British colony, so they're a common law country. They speak English. The elites of Solomon Islands send their kids to Brisbane, Melbourne or Sydney for schooling. They don't send them to Beijing. They don't speak Mandarin. What is it in this? And when you look at, if you look around the Solomon Islands, you look at the provincial governors and you look at the people of Malaita, who are the most upset about what's going on here, they are strongly opposed to what's going on. So what Manasseh Sogavare has done, he has fomented unrest inside the Solomon Islands for his own political purposes, and he's enlisted the support of China to pursue what is in China's interests and in Manasseh Sogavare's interests, but I would contend quite strongly not in the interests of the people of the Solomon Islands. To have Australia be rejected in this way is a slap in the face that I think is completely unwarranted. Australia has been so generous to the Solomon Islands. This is extraordinary. But I mean, all kudos to China. Very, very clever the way they pulled this off. But to say that, this is the country, China is the country that says, we are big, you are small. To talk about us being two sovereign states, that's not the approach they take in the South China Sea. It's not the approach they take to ASEAN states, that they pick off one at a time. It's not the approach they've taken to relations with the Philippines over the arbitral tribunal ruling of 2016, where they simply ignored it. Okay. So this is a complete set of standards.
Victor, I'll let you reply, and I'd also like you to address one of John's first comments there about this not being the choice, really, of a sovereign nation necessarily within the Solomon Islands. It's more about politicians being paid off. What does China say to that?
First of all, I think if John is serious about this, come up with all the evidence. You cannot just make false accusations against two sovereign nations, China on the one hand and Solomon Islands on the other hand. Such false accusation will have legal consequences. Secondly, what John says is really a very stereotype of colonialism. The fact that you say that Solomon Islands was part of the Commonwealth, speaks English, etc., therefore they should follow the leadership, if any, of Australia. No, time is changing. South Pacific is changing. The Pacific is changing. And there is no denying that China is the largest trading nation of many South Pacific nations. And China is the most important economic player with Australia. And China has the largest amount of sovereign debt in the United States. All these are real facts. And I hope, John, you will wake up and acknowledge that this is the realities you are faced with. And when Solomon Islands, which is a sovereign country, and China, another sovereign country, after reaching an agreement to cooperate closely to partially protect the Chinese communities if there is any disturbance in the Solomon Islands. And this is because in the last round of the disturbance, the Australian forces, I was told, refused to help the Chinese communities in the Solomon Islands. This was the driving force of this security compact between China and the Solomon Islands. So we need to adjust ourselves to the changing times, including in the South Pacific.
Okay, John, I can see you disagree, but so does Patricia. I want to give everybody equal time. Patricia, then let me come to you. Go ahead.
Okay, so a couple of things. Professor Gao talked about evidence. I think he needs to provide evidence that that Australia didn't support the Chinese community in the riots in November. I don't think there is any evidence. I think it's an accusation without foundation. Also, I would like to point out this us and them between Australia and China, we really need to remember that there are many people in Australia of Chinese descent. They are an important, integral part of our country. So this us and them between Australia and China, I think it's a false consciousness, and I think it needs to stop because Australia and China are an integrated community. There are so many people in Australia who have family, deep ties.
Fair enough. But Patricia, I mean, I have to go back a bit to what both John and Victor were talking about in the history of the relationship between Australia and the Solomon Islands. I wouldn't say, in some cases, it's not exactly the warmest, fuzziest history between two nations. I mean, Australia was accused of using Solomon Islands slave labor, actually, to bring over for sugar plantations. That still resonates with people on the Solomon Islands. And you've said yourself, Australia needs to take bold steps to reinforce relationships with Pacific Islanders. So yeah, is Australia, what does it need to address? Not just historically, but, you know, going forward and building a better bond with some of its partners in the Pacific Islands?
Yes, okay. So one of the things that I've criticised and the history that Australia has with the Solomon Islands, as you said, is long and complicated. And there's parts of that history that Australia should not be proud of. The way that Australia has treated Pacific Islanders that live in the arc around the northeast of Australia is something that Australia really has to reckon with. And I don't think that they properly have yet. Now, one thing that Australia has prevented Pacific Islanders from doing is enjoying living in Australia like so many Chinese people do. What I think Australia needs to do, and the Labor Party recently has announced that it's going to increase the number of Pacific Islander people who can come and live in Australia as permanent residents. Now, this is a fundamental part of improving the bonds between the Solomon Islands and Australia, and also allowing Solomon Islanders economic opportunities that they currently don't have, and opportunities for education for their children, and it is a fundamental it's a fundamental thing that Australia must address. And Australia, to this point, they've tried to fix things in the Solomon Islands, without allowing a lot of Solomon Islanders into Australia.
Right.
And I think that's thing that Australia needs to do. And it's not colonial, it's anti-colonial.
So now, now we are where we are, though, and we just have our few minutes left. And, you know, we have to go back to what we're talking about today, being the potential backfiring of the AUKUS alliance. And we talked about, John was especially saying, you know, criticizing this Chinese Solomon Islands deal as not being transparent. They won't release the details of it, but there's the same argument on the other side that AUKUS snuck up on everybody. The Solomon Islands was not made aware, and then they have the gall to say, oh, it's not about Beijing. This agreement is not about China. And people are laughing at that. And now we have the security alliance between Solomon Islands and China saying, oh, no, we have no intention. John, I'll come back to you. There's no intention and there's no military element here. But still, we have Australia feeling it has the right to declare any Chinese military base as a red line. We had a Chinese colonel actually say that's laughable if Australia thinks it's in a position to say that. But John, do you think Australia should declare red lines in this case?
Yeah, look, I don't think the idea of a red line has been at all helpful. It's really, in fact, a little bit counterproductive. But let's be clear. You know, this is Australia has been the major benefactor of the Solomon Islands. This pact has come up. To compare it with AUKUS is really, I think, very unhelpful. Let's not forget, Australia already is an alliance partner with the United States, and it has security arrangements with the United Kingdom that go back over a century. So the idea that AUKUS is somehow a dramatic transformation is, I think, you know, it's more political spin than anything. We don't have much to show for what AUKUS was about initially, really. It potentially might happen in a decade or so, but we're seeing Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States in close alignment on a number of issues. And look, what's really interesting, Andrea, is that behind the scenes, a lot of people in Southeast Asia and the Pacific are quietly they're quite okay with Australia being more closely aligned with the United States and with the United Kingdom playing a role. Why? Because most countries in the neighbourhood are deeply worried about the need to counterbalance China. China's authoritarian behaviour, its assertiveness in the South China Sea, its reinventing of the rules about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's claiming to Obama's face that they're not going to militarise these constructed islands in the South China Sea, only to turn around and then militarise them. This is generating enormous concern about us not being able to take China at its word.
Okay.
Now, when you think about
we have 1 minute left, and I do need to let Victor get a response into what has been said. Go ahead, Victor.
Thank you very much. First of all, John, no matter how much benefit Australia has provided Solomon Islands, it doesn't reduce the sovereignty of the Solomon Islands. So treat with Solomon Islands with full respect and fully respect its sovereignty. Secondly, AUKUS is in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's in violation of the South Pacific nuclear-free zone. It will really bring in greater tension, not only in that part of the world, but in the Asian Pacific region as a whole. Another point, we know for sure, everyone in China in the decision-making circle knows Australia has a blood treaty with the United States. So if there will be any conflict, Australia will fight together with the United States, with whatever enemy of the United States. We know this for sure. But this does not give Australia more reason to be a warmonger. You need to be a force for good between China and the United States. You can be a good go-between or mediator between China and the United States. You really do not want to rush to the front as a foot soldier of the United States, stirring up a more confrontation rather than diplomacy.
Victor Gao. John, I'm not sure you have a response there, but I'm going to have to give Victor the final word because we are actually over time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us.